Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event. My name is Josie Warden, and I'm Head of Regenerative Design at the RSA. If you'd like to join the conversation online, then you're welcome to do so using the hashtag RSA Food on Twitter or in the YouTube comment box. I'm really pleased today to have the opportunity to talk to Professor Tim Lang about our food system, the politics that shape it, and what we can do to ensure that everyone has access to healthy and good quality food. Tim is Professor of Food Policy at City University, London, and an expert in the role that policy plays in shaping and responding to our food system, particularly around issues of sustainability, social justice, and health. His latest book, Feeding Britain, Our Food Problems and How to Solve Them, is a really timely and fascinating investigation into where our food comes from, what we do with it, the problems in our system, and how we can respond to them. So I'm really looking forward to talking to him about that today. And welcome, Tim. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
I'm wondering if I could start actually by talking about one of a really central theme in your book around food inequality. Could you explain a little bit about what that means in the context of a country like the UK, and also what the last year has taught us about this, when we have COVID and Brexit? What have we learned about the kind of food insecurity or lack of it in the UK?
Well, I don't think we've learned anything actually really sober to start off with. I think what's happened is a little bit of re-emergence into the mass media of what people like me, and probably you, have known for a very long time, which is in an unequal society, diet and diet-related health and ill health are unequal. And that was the case 10 years ago. It's the case now. So in a sense, we've learned nothing at all. What's happened is the political awareness has gone up, the embarrassment of government normalized the situation has gone up, and some very interesting campaigning that had been going on for a long time got some really interesting new support, the sort of the Rashford effect, which is wonderful. But if you notice, the discourse is locked in exactly where we were and have been for the last 11 years, which is that inequality is normalized. And that is the case in diet. And it's shocking, and it deeply offends people in public health. It deeply offends anyone who thinks a more equal society is a better society, but it's intransigent. Very little commitment to do anything about it where it matters, because it requires structural change.
And how does it relate to, or what are the relationships between this food inequality and also insecurity around food, and the where the UK gets its food from and the sort of food system? Are there connections between those two things?
Well, you're using this really important phrase, Josie, security, and this phrase food security has in public policy, the sort of world I move in and study and contribute to, or try to contribute to, in the last 40 or 50 years. In the 1930s, in the bookshelves behind me, I've got some of the main tracts and studies done from the 1840s, actually, but particularly in the 1930s. There was a similar shock about Britain down there. There's a report from John Boyle, later became the first Director General of the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, that he wrote in 1936 called Food, Health and Income. And it became world news because Britain and the empire had that sort of political and publicity reach, we would say today. And it showed that here was the third richest economy then in the world, had this massive problem of squalid living conditions and poor diet that was showing up in life expectancy. The graphics in Boyd's report were drawn by his son or by hand. Today they would be done very beautifully in computer graphics, but the message is still the same. Today, the bottom 10th and the 10th by income have 5, 10, 12 in some cases life expectancy, years of life expectancy gaps between them within 10 miles. I'm talking to you from inner London, just north of the river from where I am, Kensington, Chelsea, those sort of posh areas. The rich parts of those, opposed to the poor parts, have 8 years life expectancy gap to Peckham. It's 5 miles away. This is normalized. It's basically about income. We know the public health evidence, what Professor Sir Michael Marmot calls the social determinants of health, that circumstances dictate what people eat. Now, here we are talking about now the 6th richest economy of the world, but food security is a public policy debate and discourse that is mostly occurring at the global level, and particularly about the developing world. And yet here am I talking straight away about the rich world. The truth is, across the world, within countries, within towns, within households, those inequalities of consumption show up in inequalities of health, life expectancy, quality of life, not just when you die or how long you live, but how long you live as a healthy person. So in my work in the last 20 years, have become gently more critical about us accepting this term food security that you used, Josie. I know why you use it, and I use it. But it needs unpicking. And what I've tried to do is unpick exactly what's at stake there. So I'm stressing food inequalities. I think the food resilience theme in food security, can countries, can households bounce back when things are hard? We need to unpick that and have more intelligent understanding about what do we mean by food security. Just to say, well, food security is okay in Britain, we're a rich country, it doesn't pass the policy laugh test. It's ridiculous, actually. It doesn't explain what the evidence shows is the case.
So at the moment, the kind of, I think I'm right in saying the assumption around with food security is that we're able, as a rich country, we will be able to access food from elsewhere because we'll be able to buy it. And a lot of our food in the UK comes from outside of the UK. Why do you think that's such a challenge? And have things like, has Brexit and COVID kind of shown, maybe highlighted more what those problems are with us looking elsewhere for our food supplies?
I don't think we've quite got there, but it's a really interesting question that you're asking. Has the last year brought this up more? You know, the food importation, food trade gap issue. Depends which figures you use, whether you're using the tax and customs figures or whether you're using by value or whether you're using by tonnage. But basically, Britain doesn't feed itself. And why, in an earlier answer to you, I went back to the 1840s, this is actually the outcome of decisions made by the British state or at the state level in the 1840s. After the Napoleonic Wars, to go back a couple of hundred years, Britain was triumphant along with its time. We sometimes in the history books, we try kind of imply that we defeated Napoleon on his own. We didn't actually, any more than that happened in World War I or World War II. But essentially, Britain was triumphant in the sense that it had a very strong navy and started looking a different way. But essentially, taxes were put in the 1815s on importations of food coming in. And that was done by then dominant landed and aristocratic interest within Parliament. And for 30 years, essentially, there was a huge row. This is when Britain was industrializing. And essentially by 1846, in the famous repeal of the Corn Laws, they were known as Corn Laws, not about corn, but that was used for wheat and cereals. In 1846, essentially the industrial capitalist, as opposed to the landed capitalist, in triumph. They said, no, we don't want this anymore. The Conservative Party split, really important politics that we're still seeing in a sense today. But they go back and try to explain that is because from then on, what I argued in my book, Feeding Britain, which is just out last week in paperback, what I argued in that was the default position wove into British public policy and public thinking, ask humans, that somehow it's okay to be fed by other people. Now, I'm not arguing that. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm not arguing a sort of an autarkic, Britain should feed itself and close borders and, et cetera, et cetera. Trade in ideas and food has gone on in a country like Britain. is probably inevitable. But to get to 50% imports is kind of strategically quite tricky, and certainly in defense terms, it's a theme I discuss in my book. Could you defend this? Well, we didn't in 1939, we didn't in 1916, and we're still putting ourselves into a very not going to be fed by the European Union, or we're going to have lorry holdups. We should think about this very carefully. So I'm going back to your first question, trying to unpick what do we mean by food security. I think we've got to have a bit more an intelligent and savvy discussion about what do we mean by that. And I'm throwing at you food resilience, food inequalities, food defense, food security in the sense of is everyone being well fed, food health, the distribution of food within that. Those become very big political issues. Now, to answer your question, we don't talk about that enough, but Brexit, and particularly January the 1st, has highlighted that. Indeed, one of the things the government is doing at the moment has made brilliantly a cack-handed mess at ports. Ports going to Ireland and ports going from Britain, England, actually, to France and Belgium. Because even food that doesn't come from the European Union mostly comes bottom and then comes through wagons and ships and on the Eurotunnel. So a big rethink has to go on. I'll be very political with a small p. It keeps talking our friends in Europe. Well, it's just them in the nether regions, actually, and that's not gone down well. And it's kicked particularly the food industry. Already you're seeing fisher folk understandably bleating about how they've been two-timed and sold out. Well, what do they expect, actually? They're now the public is learning what people and me gently tried to say all the time, which is we export a lot of fish, and the British only think fish is cod. Well, actually, I can tell you, anyone who understands fishing industry knows that, lobsters and langoustines and scallops, a lot of those things just go straight, and mussels particularly, go straight over to the continent. Well, that's called trade. So you've got to think through issues like land use, Jody. Britain, we joke about ourselves, and people used to say, oh, the wet Britain, Actually, it's a fantastic climate and very benign. And with climate change coming on, we've got lots of advantages. Climate change is a disaster for the food system generally, but we've got to hence my interest in this term resilience. Can we bounce back? Can we cope with one moment floods, next moment drought? This is a land use issue. And I'm someone who urges really quite seriously that as a rich society with this default position built into food culture, that food is available 24 hours a day, 364 days a year. It's closed in Christmas, the only day. That somehow we've got to grow up. We've got to become a bit more real. If we don't want to have Eastern Europeans coming and picking Brussels sprouts mid-winter in my home county, Lincolnshire, where I was born, well, who's going to do it? Is it robots? Well, that's more jobs going. Do you not bother about? You're happy to have Brussels sprouts coming picked by migrant labor in the Netherlands? Well, where is that? There are big issues, to come back to the term you earlier, big issues about social justice. Food isn't just nutrients, it's values. I'm always saying in a very sort of light way, value for money is not a good way for looking at food. Values for money is much better.
That's really interesting. And it sounds like with all of these different elements that there is just a real lack of a strategy. And you talk about that, of the lack of a food strategy over the last years. And I know there's one in development now in England. Why do you think that's been something that's been so hard for government or lack of interest for government to focus on creating this kind of joined up strategy that really looks at all of these different issues?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, but a very, very big question, as I'm sure you know. whichever way you cut a cake, let's think of the food system as a cake, whichever way you cut it, there are going to be slices and they're separated from other slices. So you always get this problem in public policy, the joining up problem. How are you going to join up? How are you going to integrate it? Why food is so interesting and so extremely delicate is because inevitably it's broken up. Food is foreign policy, it's economic, it's health, it's justice, it's morality, it's culture, it's everything. It's family relations, it's household, it's personal, it's population. Wow, that's a tricky sort of challenge in policy terms. But I'm going to be really nasty about our political class now. They forget their own history. They actually have been so concerned about breaking up government. The last 11 years has been shocking, actually. And the Labour government before that wasn't much better. It was quite a lot better, but not much better. And the Thatcher era and Major era, which basically said, we're in the European Union and we'll just let markets rip. So the Brits were all that let markets decide. I call that in my book, let Tesco et al. Decide. That's slightly under Tesco et al. Because they're framed by circumstances as well. But let me leave that standing. Essentially, the market mantra has run out of steam. Markets can't sort out climate change. Markets can't sort out biodiversity destruction. Food's the biggest destroyer of biodiversity, the biggest destroyer of potable, drinkable water on the planet, the biggest land use, the biggest employer, 1.1 at least billion, 1.1 billion people are employed in agriculture alone. In a country like Britain, food is the biggest employer. 4.1 million people are employed in food. Only 460,000 on the land, many of those part-time. The same number in factories, many of them migrant labor. Retailing about 1.1, catering 1.4. There's more money made in logistics, trucking food, than is made by farming. This is messy. Unless you get an overview and you have a joined up food policy, it's going to be fragmented. The financial and commodity crisis, Rosie, of 2007-8, where oil doubled in a few months, international traded food commodity prices also doubled. Oil has revolutionized food. It's not just moving it about, it's replaced labor, replaced animal labor, plowing, oxen, horses, but it's the infrastructure of food. It trucks food around. Today, as I show in my book, 1 in 5, 20% of all wagon movements are food. It's just, you can't conceive of the complexity of the food system. Satellites in the sky determine when you go and buy food at a supermarket checkout and you think it's adding bill when it goes beep. It's not, it's reordering. It's a constant, seamless movement of food commodities. In that sense, joining that up requires institutional linkages. Now, in the 2007-8 commodity crisis, Labour government, to its credit, recognized, holy Moses, this isn't the problem of Africa, which people like to think it's a problem, or Asia, far distant, where we can just throw aid at it. This is us. Absolutely right. We are overeating, malnutrition. We are the drivers. We are the powerful. We are the sources of capital, etc., etc. And to their credit, the Labour government began a review, a cabinet review. I was an advisor to it, so I was quite involved. And within a year, a new strategy was hammered out across with industries to say, we've got to sort this out. And then for 3 years, basically 2007 to 2010, a really interesting process where it became a very interesting country in food policy terms of dealing, the answer to your question, trying to join it up. And then the new government came in the coalition and threw it all away. And so here we are 11 years later, still waiting, when in fact this government has only been obsessed about getting us out of the European Union, not thinking, then what? And we're now, Josie, in the then what phase. So as I explain all of that story in my Feeding Britain book, but the reason I'm rehearsing it now with you is because it answers your question. What do we need? We need a joined up food policy. That's not saying, well, the environment is the only thing that matters. It's all of it that matters equally and well. And we haven't got the institutional architecture to do that. That's the really tricky bit, Josie. We've got to do it better. And that's partly why people like me get very sort of troubled by the lack of institutional architecture in the British state. We've devolved to Scotland a bit of power, to London, nothing on food, a bit to Wales and sometimes to Northern Ireland, and we don't quite know how to deal with England. Actually, we just decentralize and create what I call in my book a bioregional system of governance. The 8 regions of England could start developing bottom-up joined up policies to fit with a joined up national policy and so on. It's not the wit of reasonably intelligent policymakers to sort that out, but they're not doing it because they're not under pressure. The questions I ask in my book, why does it take wars or crises to get the British state to do the right thing about food?
The way you lay out all of those different aspects is really helpful, because I think for many people, the idea that, for example, we have an agriculture bill that doesn't talk about food is really antithetical. You sort of assume that farming and food are always inherently connected. So understanding actually that there are all of these different drivers that are pushing it in different directions is really helpful. And I think often our food problems are positioned as a kind of zero-sum game between health or sustainability or price. And so often it's at the moment, as you say, the value rather than values, the kind of financial value, the price that kind of wins out. How can some of these competing sort of interests be brought more closely in line with one another?
That's another great question, Josie. The short answer is with difficulty, but it'll be done. I try to show in my book that there was a moment when there was a realization at the end of the 2000s, when the British state, after the financial and commodity crisis, realized it got to do it, but other G7 economies did likewise. Across Northern Europe, there was a really interesting exchange and discussion going on between the Dutch, the British, the French, the Swedes, the Germans, to say, look, we've got to actually have a different framework of understanding. And in academic terms, we've got to apply multi-criteria thinking to food, not just say if it's cheap and if it's on the supermarket shelf, it's okay, because it isn't. But that's tricky. But the bit that's missing is political leadership. Unless politicians want to do something, it doesn't happen unless there is massive pressure from below, from the people. And in food politics, there is now a very articulate food movement, but it's fragmented. Animal welfare, conservation, environment, health, consumers, etc., etc. That doesn't help. There's not enough unity, but very good people try to pull that together, and there is more alliance working in civil society than often the public is aware of. But the environment and conservation movements, I must have a go at them, and I've written to them and with this privately. I think they've backed themselves into a corner with thinking it's all wonderful, this agriculture bill, because it ain't. It's not resolving other people's land use and so on. But anyway, I'll let that be. What we need is a new institutional architecture. We've got to sort out the problem. We've got to have not the, I think, pathetically weak LEPs, the local enterprise partnerships that replaced already pretty regional development agencies in England. We've got to actually really get a grip of English governance, and we've got to decentralize it. It's ridiculous that mayors have food powers. They should do. mayors were given powers from the 1860s in response to dealing with adulteration of food. We need that again. We need a rethink about governance, food governance. It's very policy wonkish, but I don't apologize for saying that in a talk to the RSA. You know, that's what the RSA has done well historically, is thinking through those things. And we need to do it again, Josie. We need to do it in a very big way. And I'm troubled that the present government is again fragmenting. We created DEFRA, Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, to try and have some bit of joining up. It's now might as well be 3 separate ministries, frankly. It's not joining up. But hey ho, we are where we are. that's where we are. But my job is to say,
yeah, what we can do next. And you talked earlier about that sort of devolution and bio-regional responses to this challenge, and the challenge there with LEPs. Can you think of any, or can you give us any examples of what good practice might look like if we kind of move to more of that sort of bio-regional approach? And are there other parts of the world or that you've seen that kind of good practice happening or interesting practice happening?
Well, I mean, it's easy to say, but one always looks to the Nordics, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, etc., are small in population terms, but they've got a culture of cooperation. I mean, look, Britain's just left the European Union, or UK has left the European Union. The consequences of that are not trivial. Well, I don't want to go back to that. I think unless we address, do we want to talk to others about food? Do we want to have food as something which is negotiated, or is it just imposed? Well, those are very big policy principles to discuss. We haven't got, as I point out in my book, Feeding Britain book, we haven't got a navy to protect us all. We haven't actually got cybersecurity adequate. One of the surprising things to some of my colleagues, as I said, look, if cybersecurity is intrinsically important for food defense today, and I'm not seeing enough going on in the national cybersecurity strategy about food defense. It's pretty easy to take out the distribution system, the just-in-time system, by taking out satellites. But we won't go there for the moment, flagging that. It's very serious indeed. So the joining up isn't just touchy-feely at the local level. It's actually very important strategic issues about national security in the defense sense. But on good practice, let me be very prosaic and go back to something I flagged very early on in this discussion with you, Josie, which was horticulture. Britain doesn't grow enough vegetables. Now, I was a child in India. I love mangoes. Do I expect Britain to grow mangoes? No, come on. Bananas, Britain's favorite. Come on. Pineapples? No, etc. Well, there's a lot that we can do. To be importing pears and soft fruits is ludicrous. Absolutely ludicrous. And it's also an imperial water exchange. You're buying in from very often water-stressed countries. Embedded water. Food is embedded water. Think of it like that, and you look at food very differently indeed. Now look at horticulture. We have, what is it, last time I looked properly, about 7 major carrot growers. A lot in old fenlands. I was born in Lincolnshire. The Lincolnshire fens are below sea level. Now just apply a climate change lens to this, Josie, and by the end of the century, pretty likely sea will have gone up a metre. Sea defences, well, we're letting them go. Nice for wetlands and things, good for ecosystems. Let them go to East Anglia. What about growing food? Have we thought about that? No. Should we decentralise that? Should we get the 8 regions of England and North Wales and South Wales or the mid-Scotland to be thinking about horticulture? Yes, we should. Right now. That means having to think about skills and training and preparing the education. And that is a complex issue that just says, why aren't we growing enough pears? Why aren't we growing Well, the only thing we are growing more of is strawberries under plastic with migrant labour. We're back to the joins, Josie. But I've tried to give you that example. For me, if I had 1 minute, not with Michael Gove, but with Neil Parish, chair of the AFRA committee, or George Eustace, I just say horticulture, 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 horticulture.
That's really interesting. And I think, again, you were saying just now around the lack of political leadership and the need for, or a potential need for a more of a joining up of the environmental and food movements. What role do you think citizens play in that? And I know you were involved in giving evidence to the Climate Assembly last year, Citizens Climate Assembly. Do you think there's role for more of those kinds of spaces where citizens can also deliberate on the trade-offs and the values in food?
I do. I think ultimately, I'm a social scientist who's worked a lot on health, or what we call ecological health, the relationship between environment and human health. I think citizens' engagement is essential. No matter how you think about it, consumer culture has been distorted. I don't say that lightly. We overconsume, malconsume alongside vast, not pockets, but lakes of underconsumption in this rich country of ours. Citizens' engagement is really important. One of the pleasures in my life, and one of the things that surprised me since my Feeding Britain came out, was huge discussion going on about it. And I was really privileged to be asked to come and be one of the experts brought in to put the company wealth into the Climate Assembly, an unprecedented 6 Commons parliamentary select committees joining together. But now, to be frank, the Climate Assembly produced a really rich report, and food was a serious element of that, and it came up with really good recommendations. But what's happened since? You go through these processes and government just sort of said, oh yes, thank you. Off it's pushed. But what interests me, Joseph, is around the country, there are extraordinary discussions going on. In the lockdown, in the last year, I've been talking to hundreds, thousands of people who, asked me to come and do a talk or do, 600 people on a webinar. There is a really big interest in this. So I'm not confident, but I'm really impressed by the literacy that's building up and the quiet pressure that I think is emerging. And it really, it's not 1939, but it's certainly a 1937 moment of where there is rapid politicization with a small p of food politics. People are beginning to realize just having a supermarket say, we'll look after you, sunshine, that ain't a good food policy. Let me tell you, as someone who talked to the food industry a lot, I've never known them so worried, ever. Ever. They're just about coping with just-in-time systems that they've locked themselves into, but shelves are not actually perfect. And big dislocations going on. And we haven't even got to the situation of where Britain imposes its customs systems. And as a colleague of mine said to me the other day, in the name of getting away from European bureaucracy, we've got an incredible bureaucratic system now being applied to the food system. Small businesses which have now pulled out of doing trade, and other small businesses in food that have just relocated to the European Union. Now, this is a big economic impact because it wasn't thought through. It just wasn't thought through. But we are where we are. My reading of British food history is this has happened lots because we have this, what I call the sort of imperial default position. Don't worry, other people will feed it. Actually, I'm not so sure about that.
And it's, I think that term food imperialism is it feels like quite a shocking term as well around, I think for a lot of people not having really considered like where stuff comes from, or the fact that we're relying on, as you say, the kind of water or the labour or the land of other countries to feed us. And you talked earlier, and you mentioned just then as well, around supermarkets and the sort of approach we've had around let Tesco sort it out mentality. And obviously the supermarkets this year have done incredibly well compared to lots of sectors during COVID. Where do you think there is, where are they kind of owed credit for some of the things they've done, and where actually is it showing a kind of dangerous approach to food? And also, have you seen any interesting responses from more grassroots food suppliers or movements around tackling some of the problems of supply during COVID?
The single major strategic mistake the government made, which was a sign that they had not done preparations of food resilience. For goodness sake, we had cabinet ministers who didn't realize food came across the channel. I mean, it's staggeringly incompetent and indeed stupid. But it happened. The supermarkets worked their socks off and flows were disrupted. But they were given a present by the government by closing down the hospitality industry. I was highly critical of that. The hospitality sector should have been reorganized to become local and more community feeding centers. Why? Not just because it would have been sensible and because history shows you need those facilities, but because the hospitality sector has become 30% of the food system in Britain. Not it's the biggest employer in the food system, but it's vastly important for small suppliers and SME sectors, the small and medium-sized enterprises, and it just has destroyed those. I've had famous chefs and many people. I used to be a trustee of Borough Market. Borough Market, this champion of sort of the new wave British approach to food. It's actually Borough Market. It actually looks after 150 businesses in that 1 acre site. And I learned a huge amount from my 10 years as a trustee, non-paid, non-profit. It's the only non-profit market in the world that we know of. And I'm quite well informed about the sector. That was really, really messed up by how the government just said, leave it to Tesco et al. The meetings and the open letter to the Prime Minister and the government that two colleagues and I from Cardiff and Sussex Universities, Eric Milstein and Terry Marsden, wrote to the Prime Minister an open letter, but for the public as well, last week. We said, look, this is inexcusable, this lack of preparation for food emergencies. And they relied just upon nine companies, which have 94.5% of the retail market. They gave them the other 30% and then complained when the British went and emptied the shelves. Well, they emptied the shelves because the government said you couldn't go and use the hospitality sector. Instead of organizing the hospitality sector to maintain those supplies and to develop in emergency situations something different. Everyone recognized that this was an emergency, but the lack of preparation says something. Again, I go into and I declare an interest. I'm on one body I'm on at the moment is the London Food Board for advising the Mayor of London, for Sadiq Khan, but I was for Boris Johnson too, and the Mayor of London. The system set up after the lessons from the lorry strike of 1999-2000, that period, of creating the Civil Contingencies Act 2004, set up what are called resilience forums. And these are supposed to be local emergency preparation bodies. And let me do it, without disclosing any secrets or things. When we tried to get engagement on food with the Resilience Forum for London, we realized there was no intelligence, no understanding, no one really knew, including the food industries, actually where the pinch points are and the difficulties are. And the reflex of the state when there was a crisis was just leave it to Tesco et al. So you can say they've had a great war. And there are many people in the food industry, as I quote one of them, quite a few months ago, said, Tim, it's going to be really hard to get back the power from these retailers. when some sort of normality returns. Indeed.
And I suppose on that note around power, like for people watching this or people who are maybe not necessarily involved at the policy level, what are things that you would recommend they do or read or look at that can sort of help them to create some of that upwards movement to policymakers?
Well, I think there's a really wonderful, I'm an ex-farmer. I farmed for 7 years. I wake up at 5:30 every day thinking I've got to go and milk cows, and I turn over and I go to sleep again and think, thank goodness I'm not. There is a huge debate, a wonderful debate going on about land. Some of it's very romantic, some of it's very practical, and the danger is, and I say someone who tries to contribute to that debate, don't just think the food issue is about land and the countryside and rural existence. It isn't. The food system is farming and its inputs. Farming goes bust if the subsidies go, and just wait till 2025, that's only 4 years ahead, when the subsidy system starts coming down. All the analyses show that a lot of farmers are don't think the small farmers and the big farmers will survive. Some of the big farmers are highly in debt. They've built vast factories, cow sheds and pig sheds. They're in debt and they're kept afloat by the subsidies, actually. Just look at the figures. I reproduced some of the brilliant studies done by people. The National Audit Office is reviewing again at present. So keep alive to that land and countryside issue, of course, but don't get sucked into British and a flag is on it and that deals with it. It doesn't. I'm always urging people, get wise about the complexity of the food system. NGOs, the Sustain, the NGO Alliance, puts a lot of this together. It does fabulous work on that. I have to say this, and please don't think I'm flogging a book. Borrow or read my Feeding Britain book. This is where I tried to summarize, complexity in a way that was okay for people. And well, it's the hardback sold out completely. So it's come out in paperback. Borrow one, read it. There are discussion groups discussing it. What do we do? Get wise to the English National Food Strategy. Have a look at the Welsh strategy. The Scottish Nourish movement is fabulous. Is it doing enough to get us to your phrase, social justice, socially just food system? No, it isn't yet, Josie. I'm very sober. But unless we, the people, contribute to that, back to your question about citizens' engagement, the politicians will not deliver what we need. Educate your MP. The animal welfare movement is fantastically well organized with its MPs. In the lockdown, Holly and I, we put together 28 different signatories from right across the food system, writing to the retailers, private letters, writing to the manufacturing. Where are you going to jump if it comes to hormone-fed beef? Are you going to import it? Yes or no? Because that's going to lower food standards. Similar movements being now about gene editing, for example. Now, I'm not worried particularly about gene editing. It's a question, where does it go and who's going to shape it and for whom, what purposes, whose values are going to triumph in this, Josie? So I think there's an engagement that we can have without being obsessed. And I'm someone who enjoys my food. I have to say that. Don't stop eating. Enjoy your food, but take it more seriously, is what I always say. Because there's a whole world of values goes into your mouth, and much of it is out of sight. I was a child in India, and I love rice and dal. Just look at the figures. I put them in my book about the embedded water that comes into Britain. Our national dish, curry, or national dish, pizza. Unwrap it and have a think about it. So There's a joined up world that goes down our mouths, Josie.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really good message to end on, that sense of actually really enjoying food and thinking about the aspects and the complexities that go into it. And I think your book does a fantastic job of that, of really understanding that. And I think we're so often pushed to consume differently by switching our milk or our meat, etc. But I think really understanding those complexities that go into something and educating ourselves is so important. So thank you so much for joining us today, Tim.
Let me flag too, this is a really important year for Britain. We host the G7 in July. We're hosting the COP26 meeting in Glasgow in November. The UN Food Systems Summit is happening in September. Everything that we've talked about, Josie, is up there being discussed at the global level, at the national level, at the rich world level, but it's not happening at the local level. Oh, yes, it is. In the lockdown, I've talked in Dorset, in Kendall's doing the climate change citizens jury. Tap into something that's happening in your area and join it and discuss it. Discuss it. It's too important food. Leave it to Tesco et al. Or crazy imperial default positions. Let someone else feed us. It's time we grow up, really, as a culture.
Thanks, Tim. And thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. It's been a really informative look at one of the most important issues of our time, and a really important time, as you say, this year particularly. For those of you watching, I really hope the conversation has given you an idea of the sorts of insights you can get from Tim's book, Feeding Britain, which is, as I say, out now in paperback, and really recommend it for pulling together all of those different aspects and understanding much more around what really happens in our food system and what can be done about it. So make sure you keep up to date with the RSA's channels for more events like this one, as well as updates from our policy research teams, particularly our Regenerative Futures programme, which is exploring much more around how we bring together social and environmental justice to tackle the challenges we face, such as climate change. I think that's all from me. So thank you very much for watching, and thank you very much to Professor Tim Lang.